Hi, this is Mrs. Horseman, and today we're going to be talking about populations. So the last time we talked, we learned about ecology and ecosystems and how energy was transferred between organisms that were within that community. So today we're going to look a little bit more closely at relationships between those populations that are within that ecosystem. I also said last time that there are a ton of vocabulary words that you're going to have to make sure that you really truly understand for this unit. And this is the same idea for this section. There's a ton of vocab that you really need to make sure that you know in order just to get basic. So that being said, here are some of the things that you have to do to be proficient. Predict the outcome of when two species are forced to occupy the same niche. List examples of the 3 types of symbiosis. Identify if an environmental factor is population density dependent or population density independent, and describe the population growth, whether it's exponential or logistic, and what that means. Okay, so that being said, when we're looking at biological communities, what we're looking at is different ways that organisms interact with one another, and there's 3 different ways that we look at that. There's predation, there's parasitism, and then there are providing relationships. So predation would just be a predator that is eating its prey, gaining nutrition from that, gaining energy. Parasitism are organisms that prey on other organisms. They don't kill them, but they definitely use them for nutrients and to get their resources. And then providing relationships, where it's more both of those organisms get something out of the relationship. All right, so relationships between organisms, like I said, there were 3 different kinds, so we're going to be looking a little bit more specifically at those. Parasitism is when one species benefits and the other is harmed. Typically, the one that is being harmed is not going to die because of that parasite, because if that happened, then the parasite would be out of a source of nutrition, or out of a source of energy, or out of a host. So typically the parasite harms that organism, but they don't kill them. Mutualism is where both species are benefiting from that relationship, and one example that I use is clownfish and sea anemone. Some sources say that this is actually a different kind of relationship, that it's commensalism, but our book looks at this relationship as mutualistic, which means the clownfish is benefiting and the sea anemone is benefiting. Another example is commensalism, which I just mentioned, and that's where one species benefits from the relationship, but the other one is unaffected. And then the last one that I did mention before was the predator-prey relationship, where one species kills the other species and uses it as a food source or for their energy. These types of relationships are called symbiosis, okay, or symbiotic relationships, and that's where 2 or more species live in a close long-term relationship with one another. All right, so here's an example of parasitism. This is a mosquito biting a human, and they actually suck the blood from humans and other organisms to get their nutrition source. Same thing with fleas, kind of gross, but that's part of an ecosystem. Mutualism is, like I said, where there's 2 organisms that have a relationship together. In this case, the one that I'm showing you is actually a 3-way mutualistic relationship. And what we see here are some ants. They're actually some stinging ants. This is a butterfly caterpillar. And then we have, I call it an acacia tree. I've heard it being pronounced like 5 different ways. I call it acacia tree. So within this relationship, the caterpillars have these organs that just hold on to nectar so that they can go back and eat it later. The caterpillars are using the acacia tree as a food source. The ants are actually then using the caterpillar. They're not harming the caterpillar, they're just using some of the nectar that are in these organs that hold it as a food source. And the acacia tree and the caterpillar are both getting protection from these ants, because any type of predator that comes up and will try to eat the caterpillar or the acacia tree could be hurt by these stinging, biting ants. So all of them provide something within that relationship. None of them are actually being harmed. And actually, the caterpillar is helping the acacia tree because if you notice all the yellow stuff on the caterpillar is pollen. So that caterpillar will then move on and pollinate the tree. Kind of cool. Another example of mutualism is a clownfish and a sea anemone, and I'm going to show you a video that talks a little bit more about that one in just a second. And then commensalism. If you see down here at the bottom, this is a whale tail, and these little rocky looking things on the whale are called barnacles. The barnacles are not hurting the whale, okay? By no means are they hurting the whale. They are just there. The whale's not benefiting from the relationship, but the barnacles are actually getting a free ride from the whale. So while the whale's not getting anything out of the relationship, the barnacles are. Commensalism. In this case, a lot of sources talk about this one. I forget the name of these birds, but they are birds that typically follow around herds of livestock. So in this case, we're looking at cows, and what they do is they kind of alert the cows to when there are predators in the area. So they kind of act as an alarm system. Now, some sources call this a mutualistic relationship because they say that these birds are getting nutrition or food sources from the bugs that are attracted to the livestock. But either way you look at it, it's a relationship. All right, so I'm going to show you this video. It's just talking about some of the different relationships that I talked about. The guy that does the video is going to talk about relationships that occur in the ocean and a couple other different examples. So.
So we're in the ocean of Southeast Asia, getting ready to search for a fish that lives in a place so dangerous that most other fish won't even come near it. Ready? Let's go diving. And after a bit of searching, I finally found it. The clownfish, or anemone fish as it's also called. The beautiful tentacles of the anemone are actually deadly to most fish. The tentacles have stinging organs called nematocysts, which fire tiny darts into fish that brush by. This stinging ability protects anemones from predators and helps them capture prey for food. But how can clownfish hide in such a dangerous place? Well, that's because clownfish have a symbiotic relationship with anemones that is so important that clownfish are almost always found among anemones. Symbiotic relationships are interactions between two species that can benefit either one or both species. Symbiotic relationships are divided up into three major categories. Parasitism benefits one species while the other is harmed. Like ticks, for example. There are many examples here in the ocean. Take parasitic fish lice, for example, that cling to a host fish and feed on its body fluids. Amazingly, fish will sometimes find a cleaner fish or a cleaner shrimp to help remove the parasites from their scales, mouth, and gills. When this happens, a mutualistic relationship is formed between the fish and the cleaner organism. Mutualism is a symbiotic relationship in which both species benefit from the relationship. This bird here eats the tick, which benefits the cow. In our fish example, the host fish is clean off its parasites, and the cleaner fish gets a free meal. Both species benefit, but not the sea lice anymore. Hey, I already brushed my teeth today! The third symbiotic relationship is commensalism. Commensalism benefits one organism, but the other one is neither harmed nor helped. You might have had a bug hitchhiking on you at some point without knowing it. An example here in the ocean is when remoras hitch a ride on sharks, big rays, or turtles. The remora attaches itself with a disc on its head and then hitch a ride and feed off the food scraps that the host animal leave behind. So the sharks are not affected by the remoras being there, but the remoras get a free ride and a free meal. Sounds good to me. So back to our clownfish. Clownfish are protected from predators by living among anemones, and in exchange the clownfish chase away fish and other animals that can harm the anemone. What kind of symbiotic relationship is this? That's right, mutualistic. Okay, but we still have one important question to answer. How can the clownfish be immune to the anemone sting? Well, a clownfish must first get used to its host anemone by developing a protective mucus coating, kind of like when we use sunscreen. And there are two possible explanations for how this happens. The first explanation is that the clownfish secretes its own mucus, which lacks the substance that makes the anemone fire its stinging nematocysts. It's as if the clownfish had a protective force field or invisible cape. And the second explanation is that the clownfish uses mucus produced by the anemone. The unprotected clownfish initially touches the anemone with its fins, even getting stung slightly at first, but over time gains the protective mucus coating. Symbiotic relationships happen everywhere, even in our own bodies. Did you know that every time you eat yogurt, you're actually filling up your digestive tract with symbiotic bacteria? That's right, you become the host for these natural bacteria, and they help you process and digest the food that you eat every day. Alright, so next time you go outside, stop, look around, and see how many symbiotic relationships you can spot around you, and record what they are. And remember, never stop exploring your world.
Hopefully you enjoyed that video. I thought it was really interesting. It showed some different relationships that maybe we haven't thought of, and it was somebody different talking to you about it, so always a good thing, right? All right, so I want to talk to you really quickly about how competition shapes communities. So competition is just where organisms are competing for the same resources, okay? When we talk about organisms and their roles in the environment, we're actually talking about niches, okay? This is not the same thing as a habitat. A habitat is where an organism lives, which is part of their niche. But when I talk about niche, what I'm actually talking about is the job that they have, okay? It's the official definition is the functional role of a species within an ecosystem. It's its way of life. So here are some examples that I'm talking about. I'm referring to a jaguar. A jaguar's niche is that it lives in many different ecosystems within South America. So it lives in grasslands and deciduous forests and rainforests and marshes and kind of all over mountain ranges of South America. It feeds on mammals, fish, and turtles. It lives and hunts alone except during mating season. Then it becomes kind of a social organism, and once they've mated, they move on and go off to their own again. It gives birth from the months of June to August typically, and they hunt by day and by night. Okay, so all of these things together go into the role that jaguar plays in its ecosystem or in its community. I want to add, no two species occupy the same niche, okay? What that means is two organisms that are so closely, have roles that are so close in its ecosystem cannot live in the same area, okay? They can have overlap. So maybe we have another large mammal that feeds on small mammals, but it doesn't feed on fish or turtles. Or we have another animal that lives in maybe the marshes of South America, but they may not live in the deciduous forest or the rainforests. We may have another large mammal that hunts during the daytime, not at nighttime. So that's how niches can overlap, but no two niches, no two organisms can have the same overlapping niche. Okay, when that happens, it creates too much competition. They're competing for too many of the same resources, and that becomes a problem. So competition can limit how species use their resources, so competition can actually lead to local extinction. When two organisms enter an area where they both occupy the same niche or there's too much of that overlap, one species is eliminated. So either they have to leave the area and go find another ecosystem or another environment, or that organism becomes extinct within that area. This elimination of a competing species is called competitive exclusion. So let's look at an example. Okay, so this is called a paramecium. It's a single-celled organism. In this graph that I'm about to show you, I'm showing you that two species cannot occupy the same niche. So in the top graph, you're going to see competitive exclusion, where one species is actually eliminated because they overlap too much. In the bottom graph, I'm going to show you there's niche overlap, but those two species can actually coexist together. All right, so here's the graph that I'm talking about. If you look here, we're looking at the population density, okay? And then here we're looking at the number of days. we're looking at that paramecium that I just showed you. There's actually 3 different species of that paramecium. So in the top graph, we have the yellow group and the red group, and they both start off pretty similarly. By about day 5 or 6, they start to split off. So now we have the yellow group kind of takes off a little bit, and then you can see that it starts to crash. And eventually by day 24, we are seeing that species becoming eliminated. The red one, however, starts off kind of slow, but you see as soon as that yellow population is starting to decrease, the red population increases a little bit more, and then it levels off, okay? And that is going to continue. There is no longer competition, so that red species is going to thrive. Okay, if you look at the bottom graph, we're still looking at population density, and we're still looking at number of days, okay, or time. We're looking at 2 species, but they use different resources. So they're living in the same environment, but they are not feeding on the same source. So they are both, the yellow one, you can tell up here, it doesn't quite hit the amount that the other population did when it was in the first graph. The blue population is a little bit less than what the yellow population is, but they are both surviving in the same environment. So this is competitive exclusion, and this is where 2 niches overlap, but not extremely enough that it affects the competition. Okay, so predation and competition. Predation, even though sometimes it's hard to think about, you don't want to think about the cheetah hunting down the little baby antelope, but it's part of life, okay? And actually predation can reduce competition, and it promotes biodiversity. So the less competition there is, because there aren't quite as many of that organism around, it actually allows some of the other organisms to thrive, and there can be many more organisms that live in that environment because there's not as many of them. So even though predation can be kind of icky to think about, it is the circle of life. And if you remember The Lion King, I'm not going to sing it for you, but if you remember The Lion King, really that's what they talk about, is the circle of life. It's just part of living in an environment. All right, so before you go, I really want you to pause the video and make sure that you know the answers to these questions. If you don't, go back and rewatch parts of it and write down your answers, and we'll talk about them in class. So number 1, what are the 3 different types of symbiotic relationships that we talked about? And give an example of each. Give a different example than the ones that I gave you in the video. Explain what a niche is, and answer, can 2 species occupy the same niche? If they do, what happens? Okay, so hopefully you know the answers to those questions. I hope that you wrote down any questions that you might have,